Okay. Welcome back to the story of us, everyone. Apologies for last week when I was quite sick, not with COVID, and this week when we have COVID in our house. So we are together on Zoom, but not in person. I don't have COVID yet, and it feels like a yet when you've got a kid at home with it, but here we go anyhow. So welcome back to the story of us, the ongoing story of who the Jewish people have told ourselves that we are. So we'll do a little bit of a rehash today because we haven't been together in a couple weeks, and I think sometimes it helps to just have a sense of the whole flow of the story as we're going. So we started by talking about the very earliest people who imagined themselves as Jews. We talked about those folks, not Abraham and Sarah, sort of the mythical ancestors, but instead, who were the first people who told themselves stories of Abraham and Sarah and the Exodus from Egypt and all of these pieces that we would recognize as being a part of the Jewish story. And so 1250 BCE or so, in the area that somewhat ironically is now the mountains of the West Bank, primarily Palestinian populations, as well as settler populations, though that's a different chapter in the Jewish story. We start seeing people who tell the legend that they are the descendants of enslaved folks who escaped from Egypt. Their main god seems to be El Elyon, in fact, a phrase we still have in our liturgy, the god of high places. And of course, this makes sense, right? If we know anything about the Exodus story, the Exodus narrative, the Exodus mythology, we know that the place that Moses goes to commune with God is always up high, is always to go to the tops of mountains. Meanwhile, at a similar time, 1250 BC or so, in the south of Israel, in the pastoral, the Bedouin regions, the area where you would have sheep and goats, and you'd be a shepherd. That's the word I'm looking for there. These folks had a different main god. They had the god Yud-He Vav-He, the god that Jews traditionally don't pronounce, but some folks have tried to pronounce and turned into, for instance, Jehovah or Yahweh or Jehovah's Witnesses. That's where you get that phrase from. And these folks, they didn't say that they were the descendants of enslaved folks. Instead, their story of who they are is that they came from the great northern power, Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire, and that their God had led their ancestors there. These are, of course, the stories of the matriarchs and the patriarchs. So it's only about the year 1000 BCE when all of these groups come together. Of course, when the great southern king occupies the north, the evil occupier, he consolidates power in the south, occupies the north, King David, who's viewed as an occupier by the northerners. And so this kingdom of the north and the south only lasts for a minute, for a generation or two, when once again it splits. So now we get into the 700s BCE, and we've talked about the idea that Israel and Judah, the north and the south, are both vassal states of the Mesopotamian empires, of the Assyrian Empire, meaning they got to pay their taxes. And so we've looked at the ways that the north stops paying its taxes and is destroyed by the Assyrians, an empire in decline in the 700s BCE, and sends waves of refugees to the south, primarily to Jerusalem, who bring their Moses and Exodus stories with them. We looked at the rise in 620 of King Josiah. And in fact, we looked at King Josiah's moment as being a moment when the Assyrian Empire had collapsed and the Babylonian Empire had yet to reconstitute itself. And so there was a golden age. This was a time of real independence. We talked about Josiah's era as being really the model of King David. That when we look at King David and the stories we have of King David, they're being told by Josiah's Jerusalem in their own image, which is to say that the vision of David that we have is really a Josianic vision of David. We also looked at the era of King Josiah as one that gave us many of the documents of the Hebrew Bible that we recognize today, the books of Joshua and Judges and Kings and Samuel, and of course the book of Deuteronomy, which we looked at as the southern Jerusalem-centered retelling of the northern stories, of the northern myths, the Exodus stories. So then finally, in our last session, what we looked at was the Babylonian invasion, 586 BCE. All of a sudden, Babylon has taken control of the previous Assyrian Empire, and they wage this war against Egypt that makes its way through Israel, through Judea, and carts off the leadership into exile, enslaves them, and brings them back to their capital cities. So that is what we looked at last week, or 2 weeks ago, whenever we met last. Questions, comments, thoughts before we continue on with new content this time? Yeah, Rudy.
What drawing do you want me to do this week?
You'll have to let us know at the end, Rudy, what the content is. Maybe the Jews coming back from Babylon will be the image. Okay, so let's keep going. So we have this moment in 586 BCE when Jews, particularly the leadership, let's talk about the upper crust, the 10 to 15% of the Jewish world, who were the priests, who were the prophets, who were the scribes, who were the leadership, who were the elites of, 6th century BCE. We're talking 586. These are the folks who were taken off into exile. Scholars today imagine that right before exile, meaning the peak of King Josiah's Jerusalem, the peak of King Josiah's Israel, we're probably talking a population in total of around 100,000 people. By the time the Babylonian exile is done, 70 years later, the entire population of Israel, of Judea, is down to 30,000 people. That's 30,000 people. They think that Jerusalem itself, by this point, had been totally decimated. And so by the time the Babylonian exile is over, call it 450 BCE or so, the Jerusalem population, including its sort of metro area, would have been down to 3,000 people. So we are talking a tiny decimated region that Israel had become. And really the elites were over in Babylon. And they're transformed by their experience in Babylon. We talked about it a little bit last week. But because the Babylonians are conquering all these regions and bringing all of the most educated folks back to their capital cities, there's an incredible exchange of information that is happening in these Babylonian cities, in places that we would now recognize as, places like Baghdad. And so we get the emergence of monotheism from this moment very clearly. The idea that there is only one deity comes out of the Babylonian experience. But we talked about this last week, but there's all sorts of other ways too. The alphabet, the Aleph Bet that we think of as being the Hebrew alphabet is in fact the Aramaic Babylonian alphabet. We write Hebrew in Aramaic characters, not in Hebrew characters. The months that we have, that we think of as the Jewish months, are actually the Babylonian months that we bring back with us, as well as huge amounts of imagery and theology. So I don't know if anyone knows anything about Zoroastrianism, but Zoroastrianism is another one of these early, almost monotheistic approaches, cultures, religions. The word religion doesn't quite fit, but the Zoroastrians imagine a force of good and a force of evil, sort of two deities, almost a god and a Satan character, and a great battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. So a lot of this may sound really familiar. In particular, may ring some bells from sort of Christian eschatological, evangelical kind of images. But these Jews brought back with us from Babylon, these images. And they become Jewish, or they become Christian through their Jewish influences from their Zoroastrian influences. There's some thought that the focus on fire and Shabbat is related to Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrians worship their deity through the flame, through fire. All of which is to say that there's huge influences that come from this moment. So Jews are living in Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire falls. Not so long after we were conquered, not so long after we were enslaved, 50, 60, 70 years later, the Babylonian Empire falls. Now, it is instead replaced by the Persians. And you can think of this as just which group is in charge of the empire. Persia was a province inside the Babylonian Empire, just like Babylon was a province inside of the Assyrian Empire. We're getting all of these successive revolutions of who's in charge. But the Persians have a very different view than the Babylonians. The Babylonians had this policy of taking all of the elite and bringing them to their capital cities. The Persians, on the other hand, are interested in restoring local control and allowing for local autonomy in exchange for regular tax payments, which is to say the Persians are a lot more interested in money than they are in control, and they see autonomy as a tool to making the outlying regions of the empire go along with their wishes. Did that make sense, what I just said? Okay, Sarah Heyman, I see a question. What is your thought? What is your question?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, so I'm assuming all of the elite took what books they had and what they had, their laws and stuff that they had accumulated under Josiah, they took them with them to the Babylonian exile. Were they writing Hebrew then?
Yeah. Great question, Sarah. Great question. And in fact, that's right where we're going with this,
Okay,
which is...
well, shut up then.
So the Josianic people, right? So this is King Josiah, 620s BCE, right before the Babylonians invade. This is the golden age. When we think of the golden age of Jerusalem, when we think of King David's Jerusalem, this is the golden age. These are the people who give us so many of the documents of the Hebrew Bible. I mentioned it before, but these are the people who write Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and Kings and Samuel, and or at least edit them in the versions that we have. So one of the distinctive things of these Josianic folks and of these Josianic writings, again, this is pre-Babylonian exile, is that it imagines a God who punishes based on our observance or non-observance of the commandments. We've talked about this before, but we really can't overstate how important of a change this is. In the ancient world, it would have been understood that if your group beat my group, if you conquered us, your God was stronger than our God lost. But what happens for these Judeans after King Josiah is, since they understand their God punishing them for the non-observance of the commandments, when they're taken off into exile, they have an explanation for why this happened that works for them. Now, these groups, these northerners and these southerners carried off into exile in Babylon in 586 BCE, their main story is not the exodus from Egypt. But you can see, I think, why the experience of being enslaved in Babylon would cause the exodus to become the center of their Jewishness. The power of being an enslaved person in Babylon and having this story that says, this happened to us before, and our God remembered us, and our God led us out from this place towards freedom. Incredibly powerful. And so this is the moment in Babylonian exile when the Exodus becomes the central myth, the central story of Jewish life. But even more so, I think we have to understand that the Babylonian exile is the moment where Judaism emerges, which is to say that a Jewish identity that is portable and not connected to where you live emerges as a response to the Babylonian exile. That before this, to be a Jew was to be a Judean, was to be a part of this tribe. And tribal identity was based on being a part of your ancestral tribal location. But the Babylonian exile and the centralization of the Exodus story, and of repeating that Exodus story over and over again while in enslavement, and of telling that story to the next generation about who they are while you were enslaved in Babylon, it creates a Jewish identity that is not about living in a particular place, but is portable for the very first time. Does that make sense? Any thoughts on this? Any questions? TikTok people, I see the note about audio problems. Let me know if I think I just fixed it
I
for you.
have one other quick question.
Yeah, Sarah, please.
Um, so how were how were how were we observing things during exile? Since we no longer had the temple, we still had the priestly cult, or sort of the priestly caste, and we had them as part of the elites. They would have been scooped up and taken off. How did we practice?
Yeah, this is a great question. What does Jewish practice look like outside of the temple? Outside of the cultic practice of the temple, right? Meaning animal sacrifice or killing of animals as a part of a religious ritual. So there's lots of things that happen as a part of making Jewish identity portable during the Babylonian exile. First, we have lots of evidence of Jews throughout the ancient world. This goes on until the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, our side of zero. Jews just making temples wherever they are. There's temples in Alexandria, there's some temples in Rome, there's temples all over the Jewish world where we kill animals and practice cultic religion. But I think the other thing that changed in the Babylonian enslavement experience was the idea of story and the repetition of story being sacred itself. Telling our ancient history, meaning the study of Torah, Talmud Torah, becomes something that was done as a religious act in Babylon that was not done and was not a part of Jewish identity prior to that. So certainly there are still cultic practices that are happening, but this is the beginning of a change towards a Judaism that is not just Judaism, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, one of the pieces that goes along with this is that you can see that all of a sudden Jewish identity in exile would become religious in a way that would be recognizable as religious to us, meaning about theologies and understanding the world theologically, understanding history theologically. This would have been really new in some profound senses, certainly new as a center. And so when the Persians come to power and when Jews are allowed to return, we shouldn't imagine that there was a mass influx of Jews from Babylon, from Persia, back to Israel. In fact, it's a slow trickle, and it's a slow trickle that is done very much in partnership with the Persians. Ezra and Nehemiah are going back to Israel to lead the new autonomous province of the Persian Empire. And it's not an accident that Ezra stops on the way and gives the official version of the Torah. In fact, there's a Persian king, Darius, who one of the things that he demands, and these kind of line up with each other, but demands that there be an official version of the laws and of the sacred stories of the regions that he controls, that there be an official version. And remember that Ezra and Nehemiah are tools of the Persian Empire. They're definitionally cooperative agents of the Persian Empire. And they write out the official version of the Torah, which is to say that the canonization of the Torah as we know it into a document that is close to identical to the document that we would associate with the Torah is a result of Persian political pressures to create an official document. Does that make sense? By the way, this almost is always true of Jewish history, that it's outside agents that force internal changes that then we make up reasons for. The real reason, for instance, that rabbis gain authenticity in the Roman Empire is because once the Roman Empire is Catholic, they need an equivalent agent to represent the Jews, and the rabbis are the closest to it. Eisenhower creates the Council of Jewish Presidents because he needed an official Jew to talk to, right? Which is to say that greater powers of empire are the ones in their relationship with Jews who give us our authenticity to our power structures. So let me circle that back, and then I see Elliot's question, just to land the plane again, which is to say that it's the Persian demand for an official record that leads to the version of the Torah being written, and to there even being a notion that there would be an official version of the Torah. So I know in all of the sessions that we've been doing as a part of the Story of Us, when we've been looking at these precursors and the early stories that have emerged into the Torah, that we've been sort of avoiding this question of, but who wrote the Torah? And when was the Torah actually written? You know, part of that is on purpose. I'm hoping that you will see that actually the moment that the Torah is written in a formalized, finished version is not so important other than the fact that it is finished at that point, and we start being creative in other ways, to not have us sort of fetishize the moment of completion, but to value each of the steps in this process, each of the links in the chain. However, if you've been waiting for it, this is your moment. About 450 BCE, Ezra and Nehemiah, I have confidence you could take a time machine back in time and go and find the official Persian version of the Jewish story, and it would be the Torah, or very close to it. Elliot, you had a question.
Maybe you already spoke to this, but what was in it? What was Persia's motivation to want the canonization?
Persia demanded official records of the areas that it controlled, the provinces that it controlled, and official laws of these provinces. That seems to be the demand. Again, we're sort of reading in between the lines here. The timeline lines up very nicely with all of these things, and so we're having to do a little bit of inference, though that's very much what the Story of Us is about. But look, we even preserve this tradition Jewishly. If you know anything about Ezra, you know that he's known as Ezra the scribe, Ezra the author of the Torah, the one who wrote out the scroll. Right, not that he literally authored it, but he made copies of the scroll. This is preserved even within traditional Jewish sources, this notion here. Let me just, I know I've said this before, but let me tell this story one more time because I think it helps to see it. We were strangers in a foreign land. We had been carted off into enslavement that was generational. All of a sudden, there was a new king that came to power that had someone who was almost like a stepson to him, who became his cupbearer, who became like his prime minister, who was able to convince this new king to let his people go, where he led them through the wilderness, stopping beside the side of a mountain to give them the official version of the Torah before they entered into the promised land. Of course, this sounds like the story of Moses, but the reality that we're trying to bring home here today is that this is the story of Ezra and Nehemiah and the end of the Babylonian exile, the end of the Persian exile. And these are the people, not necessarily the individuals, but these are the generations who gave us and edited and redacted and wrote the Torah as we would recognize it today. And you can see that. You can see that the Torah as we see it today is a telling of that story as well. Okay. Any other questions here before we start talking about what these folks did once they entered into the land? Because, by the way, the Jews who come back as Persian agents are in some ways imperialist colonizers who impose their newfound fundamentalist theologies on a population that's not so interested in it. So that's where we're going next. But first, let's take hands. I see Philip, then Leon, then Helene.
You said he didn't really write it, but he made copies of it. Is that what I heard you say?
It's not clear exactly what Ezra's role is, and I don't want us to focus too much on the individual personality of this particular person who is probably historical and shrouded in mythology altogether. So instead, I would really think of it as generational, that this is the generation that experienced these events, and it is the sociological factors of those moments that make the Torah what it is today. That's what I would say,
So he pulled
Philip.
together different stories that were already out there. there.
Sure, and redacted, edited, collated, anthologized.
Yes, divinely inspired to sit and write it out.
No, later generations talk about the divine inspiration of it, but that's really much later generations that talk about that sort of divine inspiration. Instead, it's Persian political inspiration that's happening
One
here.
other little question. How long until, since it's something brand new, how long until we start studying it the way we do?
So the study of Torah perhaps even predates the official canonization of Torah as we would know it today. Torah study emerges really from the Babylonian enslavement experience. It is the portability of these stories and the focus on the telling and retelling of these stories that keeps Jewish identity alive during Babylonian enslavement. And so the centrality of the Torah emerges as a part of the canonization of the Torah, as a part of the Babylonian enslavement. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That helps.
Okay, Leon and then Helene. Oh, you got to unmute though, Leon. Not hearing you. You got to click the unmute button.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now. Go ahead.
All right. He's asked the same questions I was going to ask. I have one special question more than that, which probably is unanswerable, but it's so much like other ancient things. There must have been a oral tradition before this, and the oral tradition doesn't sound like it's Middle Eastern.
Oh, it's very exactly. There's incredible oral traditions. There's written documents. There's multiple written documents. There's multiple versions of similar stories, right? And the job of scribes in the ancient world, where documents fall apart through time on their own, was to always be copying and always be editing and always be redacting. So the notion of divine inspiration of these texts would have been absurd to these people who are making changes just like their teachers made changes, just like their teachers made changes. That's just the process of what's happening. And in that sense, it is the Persian insistence on an official version which leads to that canonization. It's the same way, this might make sense to us. Jewish prayer became a lot more standardized and a lot less creative after the printing press. Does that just make sense on its face? The same is true of Torah and what we now consider to be the stories of Torah and biblical stories before the Persian requirement to make it official. It's a similar sort of thing, but the centrality of Torah is an emergence of this moment. Helene, please.
I think you've answered this already, the other questioners. I was, that they, when they came back from Babylon, they took an old story about Moses and the enslavement and made it more relevant to their recent experiences.
Yeah.
And they centralized it because it was the closest to what they had just gone through.
Yeah, I guess I would say that yes, except I would switch the subject and the object or turn it into a passive verb or whatever it is. That the stories that succeed are the stories that give us a sense of who we are and how we're supposed to live. And the stories that don't give us those things fade out of relevance. That's just always the way that story works for all humans at all points. And so instead I would say that it's the historical experience of Babylonian enslavement that causes the Exodus narrative to become so meaningful. Right? You're experiencing that. Of course, the Exodus narrative is deeply meaningful. I think it's the same reason why black enslaved folks on these shores also gravitated towards the Exodus material rather than the Cain and Abel story or the Abraham and right, because it provided that sense of hope and future, and so that's why that story becomes centralized. Again, I think it's what you're saying. I'm just sort of putting it into the sociological rather than the theological. But that's a big one of the underlying pieces I hope you're getting from me as a part of this series, The Story of Us, is I think as a general rule, one of the problems is that we all learn Jewish history from religious leaders, and religious leaders overemphasize the importance of religious things in Jewish history. I don't know if that makes sense, but Miriam.
Did you say Miriam?
I did.
Oh, that's me. I have a hard time getting into the practical aspects of life at that time. So when you say the Persians required this canonization, what form did it take? What form? It wasn't on paper. It wasn't still on leather.
So no, it would have been on parchment, that we would have had official scrolls, parchment or papyrus, or it would have been literal written official versions that would have been kept at the temple. That would have been a part of that. And Miriam, the other piece, and this is where we're going in a moment with this story, is that this is the rise of theocrats having power. That really we can understand in many ways, or at least some scholars understand, that the generations after the return from Babylonian exile, the generations that are partnering as tools of the Persian Empire, institute a theocracy. And it's really rule by temple, where the king becomes a secondary character. And the political leadership becomes secondary characters, really only responsible for secondary pieces, that it is the temple that becomes central as a political power institution during this moment in its relationship with Persia.
And is that because there were more literate people there?
Yeah, right. Like, so.
Write and read?
Yes. So let's go forward with this story a little bit. Sarah, I see that you've got a hand up, but just hold on for one moment. Let's keep moving. And Toby, I see your hand too. And then we'll come back to it. So you get these folks who are the elites, who are the scribes, who are the storytellers in enslaved Persia, who are also the ones who have become close with Persian leadership, who have the political sechel and Machiavellian scruples to be able to get those positions, who are put in charge of ruling over this province. And so they are sent back from Babylonian exile to rule this province. They show up in this backwater that had 100,000 people, now is down to 30,000 people. They show up, and all of a sudden they see that the people there, in fact, the documents from this time referred to the folks living there as the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. Which, when you hear that phrase, you should think rednecks, with all the pejorative aspects that someone might say redneck with, right? That's what they're talking. The folks coming back from Persia are civilized and cultured and monotheistic and can read and write and have these official stories and know the proper way of doing things. And they come back and they discover a destroyed backwater where people are not monotheistic and are worshiping all these various gods and don't seem to have particularly missed them all that much. And more than that, they encounter deeply, deeply impoverished folks. And what is it that these new ruling elites come back and prioritize? The rebuilding of the temple. Now, imagine you were living in destroyed Jerusalem. You have no security. You are struggling to eat. There's been famine and poverty and plague going through the land for generations. And someone shows up to help, and what they're going to spend their money on, and your tax money that you're being taxed on what? On rebuilding the temple? And so there's huge resentments around this towards Nehemiah, and huge resentments over the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, and all of these sort of elitist projects, and the imposition of religious law on these peoples that they don't know about and don't care about, and feels extremist, and an official version of the Torah that they have to follow, and a theocratic sort of by the whip ruling. There is enormous resentment in the land against Ezra Nehemiah and the generation that comes from Persia to impose their better judgment on these people. It's really an imperial moment. And it is the imposition of Judaism, the creation of exile, on Judeans in the region. Okay, Toby and then Sarah.
Did the Persians try to influence what they were preaching, what their religion was, what the rules were, or did all they really care about taxes? Because we know that the victors usually write the history, and the history is somewhat in Torah.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, Toby. And what we know is that the political leadership of Jews during this time and the religious leadership of Jews during this time are those people who were accommodationists with the Persians. So I think we can read in between the lines. It seems impossible to imagine that that didn't influence how they saw the world and what they wrote and what they didn't write and what the laws were. And you know, we know the enormous Persian influence just by looking at the fact that the months become our months and their theology makes its way into our theology and their alphabet becomes our aleph-bet. And so we can see just the overwhelming Persian influence here. Okay, Sarah, and then we're going to start talking about the way that Jewish identity changed during this moment. Okay, Sarah disappeared.
Answered.
Oh, go ahead.
Pretty much
Oh, great.
question. So the only other thing I had along with this was, given that, you know, these people were coming back in and inserting themselves in, and they had been elite when they left, you know, how did they reoccupy this space, and how did they come in with an army, or did they come in with something to?
So yeah, great. Great question. So let's go ahead and look at some text here, actually, for a second. I'm gonna pull up. I'll share this for the Zoom people. I apologize, TikTok people. You are not going to see it, but we're gonna look at Ezra chapter 10 here. So this is from the Hebrew Bible that we are looking at. Let's do a screen share. Here we go. Okay. Ezra chapter 10. So this is the end of the book of Ezra. Let's make the Hebrew and English a little easier to look at. Okay. Well, Ezra was praying and making confession, weeping and prostrating himself before the house of God. So Ezra has come back to Jerusalem and he's discovered that the temple is entirely destroyed. A very great crowd of Israelites gather around him, men, women, children. People were weeping. All sorts of people come to him. We've trespassed against our God by bringing into our homes foreign women from the peoples of the land. But there is still hope for Israel despite this. Now then, let us make a covenant with our God to expel all of these women, those who have been born to them, in accordance with the bidding of the Lord, and all who are concerned over the commandment of our God, and let the teaching be obeyed. Take action, for the responsibility is yours. And okay, we won't keep going here. This is a pretty abhorrent moral moment. But let's talk through this as a image of Jewish identity. Because what we see is after the return from exile, there is a view of Jewishness and Jewish identity that is much more monotheistic, that only sees one deity as opposed to multiple deities, and that imagines that our deity acts with empires to control history, that our deity, our God, controls everything. This allows for an insistence and an intolerance that is not possible without it. Notions of chosenness mean something very different when you are chosen by your deity to be in relationship, just like every other tribe is chosen by their deity. That's very different than when you say you are chosen by the only deity. And so there is a nationalistic, militaristic, chauvinistic whatever these other istics are, that begins to emerge as a part of Jewish identity during this moment. And it seems to be, for the first time really, according to Ezra, related to blood. He seems to genuinely view Jewish blood and Jewish seed, those are the words that are used in Ezra and Nehemiah, as being inherently sacred, and non-Jews as defiling Jewish blood and Jewish seed, right? It's really abhorrent, racist, terrible stuff that we see here. But it's a very different view of Jewish identity than early Jewish identity, which was entirely tribal, or a sort of theological, religious Jewish identity that you might find in the United States today or a generation or two ago. This is what really feels almost a racialized Jewish identity in this terrible moment where Ezra gathers everyone who's returned, separates out the non-Jewish women and their children, and the story at least goes, sends them out into the wilderness, expels them and purifies the Jewish people through this act. So again, right, I can't say it enough how disgusting this is, but I think we can also see a different sort of Jewish identity present here. There's some other pieces that go along with this, interestingly. So if you look at Jewish names in Babylon at the beginning of the 5th century, so, 500, 490s, 480s, they're almost always Babylonian names, assimilationist names. By the time you get into the 450s, they're all Hebrew names again. Which is to say that you see the sort of nationalism, Jewish pride, etc., emerging as a movement.
So Daniel, what happens to the story of Ruth in this context?
That's it, Sarah. You're right with us. That's literally where we're going right now. So
Shut up now.
No, you're good. You're like giving the chapter headings. It's perfect. So that's the other document that emerges from this moment. The Scroll of Ruth, the Book of Ruth. Who here has read the Book of Ruth? Just a quick show of hands if you've read it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It'll take you all of 20 minutes to read the whole book. It's a short story. It's beautiful. I mean, it's just really touching and sweet and emotional. It's also really well written. Find a good translation. It's gorgeous and it's a short story. But Ruth is also a deeply political polemic as a piece of literature, and we miss that. Ruth comes out of this moment as well. Ruth is the story of a Moabite woman. And if you know anything about Moabites, they are one of the groups of oppressors of Jews. They become sort of a stand-in for just Jewish oppressors in general. And we are specifically told that Moabites are one of the very few groups that cannot join the tribe. You are never allowed to marry a Moabite. You are never allowed to conversion is a sort of foreign concept that doesn't emerge for centuries and centuries until after this, but you're not allowed to convert to being a Judean, to being a Jew if you're a Moabite. Forever asur, forever forbidden. And then we get this story of Ruth, the Moabite, who is so loyal to her mother-in-law's people that she becomes the model of conversion. Where you go, I will go. Your God shall become my God. Your people are my people. Where you are buried, I will be buried. Ruth is the paradigmatic example of what a Jew by choice is. But it's even more subversive than that. Because does anyone know who Ruth's grandson is? Ruth's grandson is King David. Which is to say that the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth, is a polemic against those who would say that Jewishness is racial or blood or genetic or any of those things, and is instead a view that says Jewishness is about peoplehood. And that the most Jewish of all Jews, right, the Messiah, the King of Kings, well, before the Messiah, the King of all kings, the paradigmatic king that we have, King David, is the grandson of a Moabite Jew by choice, which means his Jewishness is dependent on her, according, right, the mother's mother, according to traditional views of Jewish identity, or what we would now call traditional views of identity, that would have been totally foreign to these people who would have thought that it only goes through the men. But anyways, and even more so than that, the whole idea of the Messiah, the whole idea of the restoration of the rightful king, is that the king has to be a descendant of David, which is to say that the Messiah for traditional Judaism, the Messiah's Jewishness is dependent upon a Moabite convert to the tribe. So yeah, Sarah, I love that you mentioned that, because I think it's absolutely how we have to understand the book of Ruth, is as a response to Ezra and Nehemiah. And I don't mean literally. I mean, maybe it's literally a response. Maybe these are pieces of literature literally in conversation with each other as they're being written. But certainly sociologically, these refer to the two strains of this argument that are happening in the Jewish world 2,400 years ago, of what does it mean to be a Jew. And so, yeah, Samantha's saying that she loves Ruth even more so. I know, right? It's gorgeous knowing it, and seeing that such a gorgeous story is also so very political in a beautiful justice-seeking way. Okay. Other questions? Other thoughts? Okay, so we have made it through the restoration of the Second Temple. We have made it through the beginning of what comes to be known as the Second Temple period. When you think of, for instance, the book of Leviticus, which details the operations of the Mishkan, the portable temple, the tabernacle, you really should understand that that's a description of the operations, or the idealized operations, of the early Second Temple. That's what Leviticus is. It's a guidebook for those priests, those Kohens, who are starting to do their job once again at the temple in Jerusalem. And this is the moment when the temple in Jerusalem truly becomes the center of Jewish life. And the reason it becomes the center of Jewish life is, of course, that the people who run the temple are the tools of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire are the ones with the real power. So since they center temple and the power of the temple, that becomes the center of Jewishness. So to close us all out, 586 BCE, before the exile, we are a tribe of Judeans. After the exile, we come back and we have a story that is portable, that we can carry with us wherever we go. And that never changes, because the piece we haven't really talked about today is that the vast majority of Jews, and we are now at the point where we can talk about Jews, not Judeans, but Jews. The vast majority of Jews who go off into Babylonian exile stay there. Once they are given the choice to come back, they don't. Which is to say that Babylonian Jews of 450 BCE were the American Jews of their moment. They lived at a moment where, once again, there was a political Jewish entity in our historic homeland, and yet they, by and large, chose to stay, with only a minority going off and moving there. You may know there's a midrash that says that 80% of Jews stayed in the land of Egypt, and that only 20% had the chutzpah to go with Moses towards freedom. This very well might be a political dig at those 80% of Babylonian Jews who stayed. By the way, spoiler alert, it ends up being quite a good thing that these Babylonian Jews stayed, because then when the Romans destroy everything, 400 years, 500 years after this, there is another center of Jewish identity and Jewish life that can emerge. And those are, of course, the people who end up writing the Talmud. But that's for another day. Okay. Last thoughts, last questions. Nancy.
So what's the relationship between the Jews who stay in Babylon and the ones who come back? Are they in contact? Are they just simply developing separately? What's going on there?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so the relationship between the Jews of Babylon or Persia and the Jews of the land of Israel becomes a central one. We see this in the Talmud, by the way, that there are three kinds of people, actually. There are the Jews of Babylon, there are the Jews of Israel, or of Roman-occupied Palestine, and then there are the Jews who go back and forth. And there are these Jews who live at the intersection, who are constantly traveling back and forth between these communities. This becomes the moment when once again Jewish life becomes centered in the land of Israel. And that continues being true until the Roman destruction in 70 CE or so, and then the Bar Kokhba in 130, with the 130s. But then the center moves back towards Babylonian Jewry. But the influences of Babylonian Jewry are enormous, right? The Torah, the months, the theology, the so on and so forth. And then I don't think we can overstate, even as we don't know a lot about this history, I don't think we can overstate the political importance of those Jews in the capital cities of the Persian Empire and the relationship of those Jews to the way that the autonomous Jewish province of Israel was treated. So lots of complex politics here that we just don't have a lot of records of either. Isabel.
Okay, so my question is, so during this time, there is a center of Jewish life in the land of Israel, like Jerusalem, that kind of thing, and there's a center of Jewish life in Babylon, or Judeans, whatever, are they pretty much concentrated there? Like, what about, Egypt or Syria or that kind of thing?
Yeah, this is a great question. So what I would say is that the revolutions of Babylonian Jewish life during exile, meaning the portability of Jewish identity and the focus on the story as being the center of Jewish identity, changes Jewish geography forever. All of a sudden, we see Judeans begin to settle all over and to carry their Jewishness with them wherever they go. So we see, centers in Egypt and throughout Egypt. We see centers that emerge throughout the Greek Empire once Alexander the Great comes in. That's going to come in, might touch that next week. We see Jewish centers throughout Rome to the point where by the time we get to sort of the peak Roman era, call it 50 CE or something, or even just 0 CE, somewhere between 10 to 15% of the entire empire are Jews, and another 10 to 15% of the empire are Jewish wannabes who aren't Jewish and who aren't converting officially, often because of requirements of male circumcision as adults in an era without anesthesia or painkillers. That's a huge impediment. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the rise of Christian identity, because just to give it away here for a moment, it's those 10 to 15% of non-Jews following the Jewish God who become the Christians. And a big part of it, by the way, that's what Paul means when Paul talks famously about how you do not have to be circumcised of the flesh, but circumcised of the heart. We miss just how practically political of a comment that is. What he is saying is you can now be a part of this without being circumcised on your genitalia, which is huge. But again, we'll get to that in a few weeks. Okay, other questions? Other comments? Rudy.
So what did you decide? What picture do you want me to draw?
I kind of want a picture of Ezra and Nehemiah at the mountain, writing the Torah.
Well, you let me know how you spell that, because I don't know how to write it on the computer.
I'm on it. Thank you. Other questions? Other thoughts? Good to be with you.
Say Aaron.
Oh yeah, Burles.
When the group was in India, there was a exhibit at the museum that had the cylinder that was supposed to have come down from Cyrus the Great. and it was written in cuneiform,
So
not in anything recognizable as alphabet. And the story that I have heard elsewhere is that we got the alphabet from the Phoenicians. And I assume that they were Haifa, Beirut, someplace in that area, and that's where we got Aleph Bet. That's the story I've heard.
So the original Aleph Bet emerges from the Phoenicians, and it is in relationship to the broader Aramaic character system. We come back from Babylonian exile with the Aramaic characters instead of the original, more Phoenician Aleph Bet, or more Canaanite, or more whatever. And then the Persians have, right, as a part of their nationalism, a different linguistic preeminence than the Babylonians. But you're referring to an interesting, not scroll, a cylinder. So it's a cylinder that may be referenced in Jewish texts in Ezra and Nehemiah and may not be. It's not entirely clear. There's the famous decree of Cyrus the Great that says that Jews can go back. There is similarly this cylinder that does not talk about Jews, but talks about the new Persian policy of allowing return from the enslaved in Babylon. So they may refer to, they probably refer to the same thing. The Jewish references may be a specific reference to that specific cylinder, but it's not entirely clear. But yeah, your broader point is that we see a lot here of nationalism involved in language also. And that's sometimes the written form, that's sometimes the spoken form. Right, that's the old joke of what's the difference between a dialect and a language? And the answer is, of course, an army. Okay, other thoughts, other questions? Jason.
Yeah, Rabbi Daniel, hi. I get so much out of this course, but I also was getting a great deal out of the contemporary Israel thing you were doing on Wednesday night. You're no longer doing that.
The contemporary Israel things are done.
Okay.
Yeah. We are happy to bring back some more overt, like contemporary Israel education discussions if there's desire and appetite for that too. Though I have to say I'm enjoying having a break for it from a moment.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? Miriam. And I know we're at 6:30, but since we're all on Zoom, anyone who wants to jump off can jump off. And TikTokers, I see all of you there. We've got like 400 people streaming on TikTok right now. When I'm done with Zoom, I will stay on, and any questions TikTokers have, I will happily do that. Miriam, please.
This is an easy question for you to answer, I'm sure. It's one that isn't particularly relevant to the time period you're talking about, except it starts there, and we're still doing it, and I don't know why. I don't know why, when modern Jews realize that the Torah is a story. It's our story, and we love it, but we don't accept all of the religious aspects of it. Why then do we still pretend we can't pronounce the names of God?
Oh, that's a great question. Why do we not pronounce the name of God? I'm going to answer it a few.
Why do we pretend we can't?
Why do we pretend that we can't? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to answer it a few different ways. The first answer is sort of the traditional notion that we have forgotten the proper pronunciation. There's also all sorts of mystical notions that knowing how to pronounce the divine name has all sorts of power. If folks have heard of the founder of the Hasidic movement, the mystical hippie stoner rabbi, the Baal Shem Tov. By the way, there's all these stories of him doing psychedelics and things like that, so I'm really not just throwing that out there. The Baal Shem Tov, that name literally means the master of the good name. The idea that he had these powers from knowing the name, there's stories that he could fly, that he could do all these crazy things. So that's one answer. But I think Maimonides, and now we're a couple months away from where we are in Story of Us right now, but I personally resonate with how Maimonides would answer that question, which is that we don't pronounce the divine name because when we pronounce it, we create an idol. That instead we say Hashem, which just means the name, which becomes this sort of infinity marker for us to not pour anything into. Maimonides, in his notion that we have nothing in common with the divine, and so we can say nothing about the divine. What that means is that all you can do is you can say that when other people describe God, they are wrong. Right? So Maimonides would say, why can you not say God's name? Because any name that you say is an idol. You say that God is love. Well, I would say you're just taking, or Maimonides would say, you're just taking a human concept, you're creating the most extreme version of it that you see as a positive, and you're applying it to God. You're creating God in your own image. You're doing idolatry of the mind. We don't have to like that, and particularly for poets and mystics, they often have the opposite response, right? In fact, and again, now we're really jumping forward, but the writing of the Zohar, the Kabbalah, is a response to Maimonides. If Maimonides says we can never know anything about God, so we should say nothing, the Kabbalists say we can never know anything about God, so we should say everything. But again, now we're, 1,500 years in the future.
That's all very interesting, Daniel, but I'm talking about the words in the Torah. Why do we, as a modern, forward-thinking congregation, still refuse to say those words?
Still refuse to say Yahweh instead of Adonai, you're saying?
Anything, yeah. Instead of using Adonai, why can't we say Yehovah?
Yeah.
Clearly, what the word is.
I guess, look, here's my answer, and it's the same. This is my personal answer now. And it's the same answer I give to folks who say, look at the Torah, and very clearly it says don't cook a calf in its mother's milk. I'm going to eat a cheeseburger because it's not cooking a calf in its mother's milk, or a Parmesan chicken, which is the famous example, because, of course, chickens don't make milk at all, so that's impossible. And my personal answer is that I don't prioritize the teachings or the understandings of Jews living 2,400 years ago. That to me, Judaism is a conversation through time. And so the notion of keeping kosher is one that is a conversation through time. And the words that we say or don't say and the traditions that we have when we read the Torah are Jewish traditions. They're not Judean traditions anymore, even as Jewish traditions are based on Judean traditions, which isn't to say that we shouldn't feel the authority and authenticity to redefine and change and reinterpret and grab old traditions and start saying these words differently. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
Okay, any other Zoom questions? It's good to be with y'all. I'll see everyone next week, hopefully back again in person and online. Though watch out for emails and announcements because we'll see whether I have the COVID that my family now has. So TikTok people, I will be with you right now. Okay, hello TikTokers. I am paying attention to the TikTok chat now. I apologize to before only jumping in and out. Ask me anything, really, whatever you got. This is a class that I teach every week. You can find it on Zoom at centralreform.org if you want to grab. Yeah, I am a rabbi at CRC. To whoever just asked that question, you can always join this class. This week it was only online and not in person, so I thought I would try streaming it to TikTok as well, which is kind of nice. Yeah, what questions do you have? What questions do you have about Judaism, about Jewishness, about anything? Okay, I'm gonna head out. It's good to be with y'all. Take care of yourselves.